For 40 years before the First World War, the global economy ran on one of the most stable monetary systems ever devised. Every major currency was tied to gold. Exchange rates were fixed. Capital flowed freely across borders. It was called the gold standard, and almost everyone who lived under it assumed it was permanent. Then came August 1914. And within weeks, every major power in Europe had quietly done something that would have seemed unthinkable just months before. They abandoned gold. Every single one of them. What followed wasn't just a monetary policy decision. It was the beginning of the end of the world as the 19th century had built it, and the slow, painful construction of everything that came after. To understand what was lost in 1914, we need to understand what the gold standard actually was, and why so many people believed in it so completely. The international gold standard had been in full operation since roughly the 1870s. Britain, the world's dominant financial power, had anchored its currency to gold for centuries. Other nations followed, one by one. The system worked like this. Each country fixed the price of its currency in gold. Britain set 1 troy ounce of gold at £4.25. The United States fixed it at $20.67. This implied a fixed exchange rate between every currency in the system. The result was extraordinary stability. International trade flourished. Investors could move capital across borders with confidence. Inflation was low. The system wasn't perfect, but it was predictable, and in finance, predictability is enormously valuable. By the summer of 1914, the system had been running for 4 decades. And then, in a matter of weeks, a chain of political crises, an assassination, a series of ultimatums, mobilization orders that couldn't be recalled, pulled the continent into war. Every major power assumed the war would be short. Most military planners believed it would be over by Christmas. They were catastrophically wrong. The problem became apparent almost immediately. Modern industrial warfare was unimaginably expensive. Shells, rifles, artillery pieces, uniforms, food, transport. The costs escalated faster than any peacetime budget could absorb. And here was the fundamental problem. The gold standard made it impossible to spend money you didn't have. If your currency was tied to gold, you could only issue as much money as you held gold reserves to back it. You couldn't simply print your way to victory. Within weeks of the war's outbreak, Britain, Germany, France, and Austria-Hungary had all suspended the convertibility of their currencies into gold. The anchor that had held the global monetary system stable for 40 years was cut loose. Quietly, without fanfare, presented as a temporary wartime measure. Governments urged, and in some cases legally required, citizens to exchange their gold coins for paper notes. The gold flowed into state reserves. The printing presses began to run. Between 1914 and 1918, the major powers printed money on a scale never before seen. Britain's money supply surged. France's more than doubled. Germany's expanded even further, and Germany, facing a naval blockade that cut off imports, had the least ability to convert that money into real goods. The inevitable result was inflation. Price levels doubled in Britain and the United States during the war years. They tripled in France. In Germany and Austria-Hungary, they rose even faster, beginning the inflationary spiral that would eventually produce the hyperinflation of 1923. Governments also borrowed on an unprecedented scale. War bonds were sold to citizens as a patriotic duty. Foreign loans, particularly from the United States, kept the Allied powers fighting after their own resources were exhausted. By 1917, the United States had lent billions of dollars to Britain and France, transforming America from a debtor nation into the world's largest creditor almost overnight. When the war finally ended in November 1918, the financial landscape of the world had been completely transformed. The nations that had fought were exhausted, indebted, and sitting on vastly inflated money supplies that bore no relation to their gold reserves. The peace settlement made things worse. Germany was assigned massive reparations, debts it had no realistic way to pay. This poisoned European finance for the entire decade that followed. The obvious question was, could the world go back to gold? Could the pre-war system be restored? Most economists and governments assumed the answer was yes, and that returning to gold was not just possible but necessary. The pre-war system had worked. They wanted it back. In 1925, Britain made what many historians now regard as one of the worst economic decisions of the 20th century. It returned to the gold standard at the pre-war exchange rate. The problem was that Britain's price levels had roughly doubled during the war. Returning to the pre-war gold parity meant that the pound was now overvalued. British exports were priced out of international markets. Unemployment rose. Wages were cut. A general strike followed in 1926. Then came 1929. The Wall Street crash triggered a global financial crisis. Banks began to fail. International trade collapsed. And the gold standard, rather than providing stability, began to act as a transmission mechanism for disaster. Countries holding gold were squeezed. Those that needed to stimulate their economies couldn't, because expanding the money supply would require more gold than they had. The system that was supposed to provide stability was instead locking countries into deflation and depression. In September 1931, speculative attacks on the British pound depleted the Bank of England's gold reserves to near zero. On September 19th, Britain abandoned the gold standard for good, the same institution that had anchored the entire system for over 2 centuries. Country after country followed. The system that had survived the war barely could not survive the Depression. By the mid-1930s, the international gold standard was effectively dead. In 1933, the United States took its own dramatic step. President Roosevelt ordered American citizens to hand in their gold coins and certificates to the Federal Reserve, making private gold ownership largely illegal. The dollar was then devalued against gold. Then came the Second World War, and another round of massive government spending, money printing, and debt accumulation that made the question of returning to gold even more complicated. In 1944, as the war was drawing to a close, representatives from 44 nations gathered at a hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to design a new global monetary order. The resulting system was a compromise. The dollar would be pegged to gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. Every other currency would be pegged to the dollar. The International Monetary Fund would be created to manage the system. It was a version of the gold standard, but with the dollar at its center rather than gold itself. And it worked for a while, because the United States owned most of the world's gold reserves and its economy dominated global trade. But the fundamental tension that had destroyed the original gold standard in 1914 hadn't gone away. As the United States fought an expensive war in Vietnam and expanded its domestic spending programs through the 1960s, it printed more dollars than its gold reserves could support. European nations, noticing this, began converting their dollar reserves back into gold legally, as the system required. American gold reserves fell steadily. On August 15, 1971, President Nixon went on national television and announced that the United States would no longer convert dollars into gold. The last formal link between any currency and gold was severed. The world had finally, fully, arrived at what August 1914 had set in motion, a global monetary system based entirely on paper money, backed by nothing more than government credibility and collective trust. Every currency you use today is, in the technical sense, what was once called fiat money, money that has value because governments say it does, and because enough people trust that the system will hold. The freedom this gives governments is enormous. A central bank can create money in response to a crisis, as every major central bank did in 2008 and again in 2020, in ways that would have been impossible under a gold standard. Whether this freedom is entirely a good thing is one of the most contested questions in economics. The gold standard's advocates argue that fiat money tempts governments into irresponsibility, that without a hard constraint, the printing press will always eventually be abused. Its critics respond that the gold standard's rigidity was itself a catastrophe, that the Great Depression was made far worse by governments unable to expand the money supply to fight it, and that the flexibility of fiat money has allowed crises to be managed that would otherwise have been uncontrollable. The debate hasn't been settled. It probably never will be, because both sides are at least partly right, and the right answer depends heavily on which particular crisis and which particular government you're looking at. What is settled is the historical fact. A war that began with a political assassination ended, among other things, by permanently severing the link between money and metal that had defined global finance for centuries. No country that left the gold standard in August 1914 ever fully returned to the system that existed before. The temporary suspension became, over the following decades, a permanent transformation. The chain of events is extraordinary to trace. A war that was supposed to last months lasted 4 years, created reparations that destabilized Germany, contributed to the hyperinflation of 1923, contributed to the political chaos that produced the 1930s, contributed to a depression that killed the restored gold standard, contributed to a Second World War, which produced the dollar-based Bretton Woods system, which lasted until 1971. The money in your phone right now, the number on a screen that you exchange for goods and services, is the distant descendant of a decision made under emergency conditions in August 1914, extended and modified and eventually made permanent by a series of crises that nobody in 1914 saw coming. The soldiers who went to war in 1914 were fighting for their nations, their alliances, their honor. None of them knew they were also, inadvertently, changing the nature of money for every generation that came after them. Gold still exists, of course. Central banks still hold it. Investors still buy it as a hedge against uncertainty. But it no longer anchors anything. It is a commodity, like copper or oil, valuable, but not the foundation of the global monetary system. The world of 1913, stable exchange rates, freely convertible currencies, capital flowing across borders with minimal friction, was not paradise. It had its own deep inequalities and structural problems. But it was a coherent system, built over decades, that functioned with remarkable consistency. It took less than a month of war to destroy it. And it took the rest of the 20th century through depression, another world war, the Bretton Woods era, and its eventual collapse, to build something new in its place. What we built is the system we live with today, more flexible, more prone to political manipulation, more capable of responding to crisis, and ultimately more fragile in ways we are still discovering. Every time a central bank creates money to fight a recession, or a government spends more than it takes in, or a currency loses value to inflation, it is living with the consequences of decisions made under pressure in the summer of 1914. If you made it this far, leave a comment. Do you think the world would be better or worse if a gold standard still existed today? And what would a modern version even look like? A war that began over political alliances ended by changing what money is. That's not a metaphor. It's one of the most consequential things that happened in the 20th century, and almost nobody talks about it that way.